Avatar May Abode Ki Jai. As we come to the abode, it doesn't look all that rich and pleasant and brilliant as we come up the hill and see what is here. But Baba, in his generosity and foreknowledge, has in fact left us Aussies three great heritages. The first great heritage is the remembrance of his visit, which has been kept alive in anniversaries and which is still a sustaining and nourishing thing for us all. The second heritage is the presence of Baba's room, which has been a solace and an inspiration for so many of us for so long, and not to be underestimated as a gift to the nation. And the third, yes, you guessed it, which is Francis's poetry, and which has much of it was actually written here. Stay with God was composed here, and then of course a lot of it was composed in India, and Francis had the misfortune of having a master who liked to have a guzzle with his breakfast, and so he quite often had to fulfil the order in the wee small hours as he struggled for inspiration. But then, of course, the tremendous reward of an appreciative pat on the head from Baba. So that is, I think, probably you have your own list of the great treasures of the place, but for me, those are the three primary treasures. And the Francis's poetry, I don't think has been getting quite the attention that it could get, and I'm hoping that having a little chit-chat about it here will, in the future, we'll be able to have workshops on Francis's poetry, where people can prepare 2 or 3 of the poems and then come along and read them, talk about them, and engage with the poetry. Now, I want for a moment to go back in time to 1953. You've already been talking about 51 and 52 here. This is 1953, when I was in senior high school in Sydney. I went to Manly Boys High, and I remember our English teacher came into the room and said, "Listen, boys, you've got the leaving certificate coming up at the end of next year. You don't have to do poetry. You can dodge the poetry questions, which means we don't even have to look at poetry for the next 2 years. Who's in favour of that?" And it was passed nem con. I abstained, but I didn't oppose it. So in a way, this talk today is a reparation for having done that so many years ago. This is still within living memory. Hi, Jake. Hello. And of course, it wouldn't happen in our wonderful education system now, where
the question would not arise.
But in those days, there was little idea in the educational system that education might have been about uniting head and heart. And there was little idea, too, that education might have been about answering the basic question of life, who am I? And using poetry as an enormous answer to that. So that the Australian system was more or less taken over by utilitarian pragmatism and a relegating of poetry to the ornamental. Of course, Francis didn't like ornamental poetry very much. He talked about poets writing about tweety little birds and sunsets and how sensitive their own lives were and how super conscious they were of their poetic vocation and so on. He couldn't stand poetry turned into aesthetics. His poetry came out of what he'd learnt, first of all, from his reading amongst the Sufis particularly, and other traditional literature, and then also, of course, what he'd learnt from Barber. So I thought we might, start off with a poem. If we could have next. Then Barber, coming to Sydney, called a private meeting, just Francis and Bill, and said to them, "You two will stick with me to the end." And many years later, Bill recalled that this was his finest moment. And it had turned out to be true, lighting whatever shadows had fallen on the path. Hopefully, the bulk of my audience will recognise that as a poem. It's very much like a little bit of prose, but it makes a big difference, doesn't it? Cutting it up into lines, with a pause after each one, emphasising the rhythm of it, where there's a stress, giving a particular emphasis to that, taking it slowly, pausing so that you can think about it as you go. And I think if it's perhaps when you're familiar with it just as a little poem, you can feel a heart quality there. It brings out a warmth, a pathos, and the passing of time and so on. So that I just wanted it there to remind you of how important poetry is, not just in rhyming things or cutting things up into lines, but the magic that inheres even in a very simple poem like that. We're dealing with something very basic and very important. Poetry conveys, well, there's a feeling there, for a start, and then there's a completeness of an episode there. So you feel there's a significance, utterances there. And then, of course, in this particular case, for people who love Barber and appreciate what Francis and Bill have done, this is a celebration as well. Of course, Francis became convinced of the centrality of poetry in human civilization, as he showed in his stay with God. He calls for it to restore its primary function. And its primary function of poetry is the awakening of the heroic and the divine within us. Now, this is something that was totally out of step with the poetic establishment in the world, especially Australia. And Francis jumps in and reminds people that the central to human endeavour is to be reminded through the great epics and sagas and through the stories of the god men, the great traditions of mankind, the stories of Ram and Krishna, the stories of Homer. Hi there. And it's, you know, of course, yourselves, that if you've had a look in the library, how many volumes of Homer there are, how many different translations, how he tried to soak himself in that world of especially the Odyssey. And by the way, there's a new edition of the Odyssey, a translation by a woman, Emily Wilson, and it's available in Nambour Library. And I found it most readable, a wonderful opening. If you're like me and you were brought up just on prose translations, probably, of the Odyssey, which were pretty dull, but there's no excuse now. You get drawn into the real poetic experience through Emily Wilson's translation, I feel. So, and of course, Francis was also aware of our treasured English tradition of poetry. Now, at the top of the list, of course, I would put Shakespeare as a sacred poet. This is unusual because most people see Shakespeare as a champion of humanity and its variety and its inexhaustible individuality, whereas I'm convinced that at the heart of every play that was written by Shakespeare is a clear message that the only way you fulfill yourself as a human being is through conquering self-love. There's a technical term for it, philautia, and it's unless somehow you were forced by great suffering or great rejoicing or an understanding of what goes on in history, but unless in some way you were awakened by a dramatic presentation of this central faith about human beings, you weren't properly human, and it's there in Shakespeare's plays. So that's what it's getting towards, what I mean by sacred poetry. Who am I? And the answer, of course, is that you haven't got an answer that you can get in your own strength. You can only answer that by losing all reliance on yourself and surrendering to something greater than yourself, a larger capital S self rather, and that being dying to the mechanical side, to the ego-centered side of your life, and being reborn with what is already there, of course, within you, but which is in the heart and needs to be awoken. This is central to Francis's vision of what real poetry is. So, and there's lots of good poets in the English tradition who can be read in a sacred fashion. Donne, Milton, Herbert, Crashaw, Vaughan, Hopkins, Eliot, all poets who show the vision splendid of loving selflessness at the heart of their poetry, usually expressed in Christian terms, of course, but vivifying the vision of what God is. I think it's when we come to Francis's poetry and the sacred, it's important to realise that we're living in Barber's new age. We're trying to live Barber's new life, where Barber has changed things so that it's possible to have this immediate contact with the divine through our love of Barber. A private dialogue with the divine, if you like. And I think this is why poetry, which is often a fairly solitary occupation, I know there's a lot of performance poetry around, but for most people it's a quiet communing with the words on the page and a finding of oneself through those words that has now become electrified by Barber's grace that is there. Poetry read for an experience of opening the heart to the divine is there for the taking for us if we're capable of responding to it. Of course, we've got great gifts in the English tradition. You've had the 1611 Bible and the 1662 prayer book, which were part of everybody's heritage, this wonderful language glorifying God and repenting of our blindness to God, which was so central to all people in our civilization. And it's gone. It has to be renewed, of course, hopefully through people responding to Barber who can renew it. And of course, it's not just the English tradition. You've got an explosion of awareness in the world. It's grown far bigger since Francis's day of the poetry of Zen, the poetry of the Buddhist tradition, for example, of Milarepa, that Francis was so wrapped up in. But we've got to go beyond Francis now. You've no idea the number of wonderful poets in the Buddhist tradition, in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. There's this chap called Shabkar, who wrote hundreds and hundreds of the most wonderful hymns to the divine, and which wasn't around, translated in Francis's day. And then, of course, in Australia, we've got a great poet, the only one who rivals Francis, and who's almost as ignored as Francis is, and that is Harold Stewart. Harold Stewart, like Francis, came from Melbourne, and he ran a bookshop down there, and he was in the gay community in Melbourne. I don't know whether Francis had much to do with him, but he finally emigrated to Japan, and he wrote a 200-page poem of living in Kyoto with 400 pages of notes introducing you to the Buddhist tradition. So it's not just an informative textbook about Buddhism, but it's a wonderful poetic expression. The poems are around a year in Stuart's life. The seasons are passing. His life is passing through time, and his approach to God is maturing as he goes from trying to trust his own strength to being totally reliant upon the grace of the Buddha and the Pure Land, the name of the Buddha, and the Pure Land Sutras. So that too is the most amazing treasure. And he's right up there with Francis.
Geoff, what year was that was done, when he was in Kyoto?
He was in Kyoto through the 70s and 80s. Right.
Do you think he might have met Francis in Melbourne?
I'm pretty sure he would have. He had an esoteric bookshop there. Francis must have met him. But Francis probably was in a different crowd, a faster crowd than Harold Stewart. So these poets are able, through their skill in language, to convey to us a direct relationship of God and the individual, to stir us with this directness because of the powers of poems. And I think it's probably time that I had a look at Francis' poem. So if we could have a look at the next slide. You probably all know this one. It's one of my favourites. "Drunk again?" cried the hag, "respectability?" "Madam," I replied, with old world civility, "one general erroneous notion I must debunk. Re-drunkenness, he who is drunk again was never drunk. You are not drunk again with your self-satisfied rightness. The sun is not drunk again with his glorious brightness. Nor bird is singing, nor worm with wormness, nor a hunk of earth prodigiously putting forth grass, trees. Don't funk the issue. Every soul in creation is drunk with seeing. Every other soul through the eyes of its own being, judging all by the values of its own precious junk. Sure, I am drunk, hopelessly, continuously drunk, with the beauty of one who is never in stupor sunk. Although, to have made you and me, he must have been a bit drunk. What makes a poem like that work? It's so fresh, and when you look at it, it's far from simple. It starts off like almost a little vaudeville routine. Drunk? Who's calling me drunk? Yeah, I'm not drunk. With the sort of politeness that drunks often try to put on when they're trying to prove they're not drunk. And then he comes up with a statement that is on its own in the second stanza there. He who drunk again was never drunk. What the hell does he mean? It aroused a certain curiosity, perhaps, a certain bewilderment about what he's saying. Then he has a go at this self-righteous wowser. You're not drunk again with your self-satisfied rightness. But then, oddly enough, he compares her with the sun. the sun is not drunk again with his glorious brightness. What's he doing? Comparing this wowser with the glory of the sun. And then he goes on to nature in the fourth stanza. And the processes of ordinary nature. And then he gets personal. Don't funk the issue. Every soul in creation is drunk with seeing every other soul through the eyes of its own being. Yeah, we're all prisoners of our own subjective sanskaras. If you think you're seeing objective truth out there, if you think you've got a handle on reality, you're not. We're all inebriated with our own drunkenness of our sanskaric blinkers are on. And then we judge the world, we make all our conclusions with those sanskaric blinkers. We see everything through the eyes of its own being. Our own precious junk, in fact. Sure, he's like that. But, and here's the big, and how nice it is in a poem to have a punchline and a surprise at the end of the poem. I'm hopefully continuously drunk, but he's not saying I'm just the same as you are, madam, an ordinary mechanical man. I'm drunk with the beauty of one who is never in stupor sunk. And then a beautiful joke in the last line. They'd have made you and me. He must have been a bit drunk. Yeah. So that you can see how it surprises. It demands a bit of engagement with your mind before you can make any sense of it, and it's got humour, and it brings it so that it has all the vigour of nice colloquial language, but also this depth of saying something quite profound about escaping from ordinary drunkenness to the drunkenness of Baba that we need. We can't avoid being drunk, but if you can be drunk with his beauty. It's four stresses to a line, and it bounces along very nicely. Right, well, of course, Francis didn't just invent all this stuff about booze. He was getting it partly from Hafiz himself. So if we can see the next slide. This is just a translation. Now, here again to plug a book. This whole talk is becoming like a commercial. This is a readily available little paperback by a bloke called Dick Davis. I wrote and asked Paul Smith what he thought of Dick Davis, but he never replied. But I think Paul's not well. Have you heard from Paul recently, John? No, I think he's not well at the moment.
Not too good.
Yeah, but anyway, Dick Davis has done a really nice translation of Hafiz and some other poets from Shiraz, and it's just a cheap paperback and well worth investing in. Last night I saw the angels tapping at the wine shop's door and kneading Adam's dust and moulding it as cups for wine. And where I sat beside the road, these messengers of heaven gave me their wine to drink, so that their drunkenness was mine. The heavens could not bear the heavy trust they had been given, and lots were cast, and crazed Hafiz's name received the sign. Forgive the 72 competing factions, all their tales mean that the truth is what they haven't seen and can't define. I'll just pause there for a moment. It's Hafiz, because he's famous as a Sufi. He's famous for his amazing mind. But in fact, Hafiz was against Sufis. He never made one statement, apparently, to support Sufism or any ism around. His poetry, which Baba so loved, was this poetry of directness, direct relationship with God, which by reading a poem you can participate in the energy of it, the fun of it, the defiance of it, of ordinary, habit-bound, everyday consciousness, liberating you from your habitual ways of seeing things. So, of course, he's outside. He's not in the tavern. He's outside waiting. And to get in, of course, he has to get drunk. But he's getting the drunkenness from the angels. It's got nothing to do with his own merits. It's given to him from on high. It's all a matter of heavenly messengers and grace. And so he's not interested in all the scriptural dogmas and so on that are there. Okay, next. No, that's the other way. There. But I am thankful that there's peace between him now and me. In celebration of our pact, the Houris drink their wine. That's the heavenly maidens up there who reward you when you die in martyrdom, inspiring so many terrorists these days. Yeah, the Houris are all celebrating the fact that I've come to drink this wine. And fire is not what gently smiles from candles' flames. It's what annihilates the flocking moths that flutter round his shrine. That's real Baba stuff, isn't it? The devouring fire that Baba gives, not just to warm his lovers, but to destroy them. No one has drawn aside the veil of thought as Hafiz has, or combed the curls of speech as his sharp pen has, line by line. Like Baba, poetry is full of metaphors. Baba was using metaphors all the time. And it's here, there's a lovely original thing that just takes the breath away, really, as poetry itself, combing the curls of speech with his sharp pen as he dips it in the ink and writes line by line. So this is the sort of tradition that Francis was able to tap into because there were English translations, and not as lively as Dick Davis's, I think, but then Francis, of course, got fed up to the back teeth with Baba's listening in, I suppose, Farsi, was it? That he was having them endlessly read to him in Farsi and Baba, and Francis couldn't understand and was bored stiff sitting there trying to keep awake. But even when we get it just in a translation like this, a good translator can bring the aliveness through in poetry. So, what have we got there? Well, we've got physical immediacy, an arrogance and cockiness that's there, not trying to be saintly or resigned, but being himself in the poem. A recognition, and this is really important for Baba lovers, is that paradise, heaven, is not just a matter of the future, but it's there all the time, and to be awoken through the gift of grace and one's great gratitude in accepting it. So it's cutting through bullshit, if you like, in a way that scandalised many people, as of course Francis's poetry would, if anyone took any notice of it, and freeing people from the bondage of habit, you could say. Righto. Yeah, of course, Francis, I think it's the next one. Yeah. Our indefatigable archivists have discovered a new note from Francis that no one was aware of, and this actually, what Francis says at the beginning of this is recorded in Lord Mayor. It's easy to find in the online version. But Barber spoke to Francis while he was working on the notes to stay with God. And this is how Francis recorded Barber's words. The scriptures are like rotten bones, rotted, and are as food for worms. Theosophy and philosophy are like good bones, rotted, and are as food for vultures. The writings of inspired poets are like fresh bones, and are as food for dogs. The writings of spiritually advanced saints are like flesh, and are as food for tigers. The writing of living perfect masters are like brain, and are as food for men. So he continues to Francis. You may go through the scriptures superficially, only to drive away the barking dogs when necessary. For instance, when you're called upon to answer the qualities of the priests and the orthodox. Put all your heart in the notes of Stay with God, which will turn out to be ever fresh brain. Wow. Brain is what perfect masters. You know, I mean, Barber, to a large extent, took the responsibility of what Francis was writing as his own, his inspiration for Francis. An amazing fact. His opinion of Francis's poetry was very high, wasn't it? Tian, you can remember probably.
Baba said, God Speaks and Stay with God are the two most important books to read. And he also said, Stay with God is food for the brain and feast for the heart.
Yes. Enormous bequest of treasure, of Barber treasure there in Francis's work. Okay, if we could have the next slide. Oh, you'll have to go on past. Yeah. Thanks. This is poem 77 of The Beloved. The Beloved is all in all, the last collection of Francis's. If we expect rewards, we've gone over to the Beloved's enemies. Even realisation of self, our right, will be when the Beloved shall please. If we cannot remember the billion years of the tangled seabed, the wave and circuitous currents, when hope of shore coming was dead, we should not come ashore when born there, but plunge back into the deep, for the tides to rock in comfortable, unending, sub-dream sleep, to clamour, even silently through tears, that now is the marriage season, forgetting the long travail and dead hopes, is no less than treason. For myself, when the chasm yawns before me, I will joyfully shout, for the eons of journeying will be seen as a little walkabout. I will bow before the face of my beloved, before his ocean of bliss, considering another 1,000,000,000 years but a moment for the whim of his kiss. I will drain the chasm's wine cup to its last drop of separation and beg, my last begging, for it to be filled again for oblation as an offering to him. Well, here again, it's quite a lot going on in a poem like this. To expect rewards, and so much of what Barber did was to turn away the greedy, the career-minded, the spiritually ambitious, the expectors of blessing and benefit. They still come. People still turn up, gimme, 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 gimme. But Francis reminding us that it's not anything to do with that. In fact, you're the enemies of Barber if you come with that sort of attitude. Even, it's not on to start asking for the realisation of self, which he beautifully says is our right. We're going to get there, but to demand it as a reward for something we are or do is not on. We've got to remember the long perspective of it, the 1,000,000,000 years that we've been through on the tangled seabed. See how poetry with one image brings things alive. We're caught in the wash of countless tides of the sea of confusion that's here. Round and round, circuitous currents, when hope of shore coming was dead. We've gone through this immense period when we didn't have a hope of reaching the shore. Now is the marriage. Now, even to ask and say, all right, I've made it. This is the marriage season. Barber, I want union. You've got to keep in mind what has created you at the moment, the long travail, the great effort and suffering that's been there, and the dead hopes, how often we've hoped before. To forget that is to be treasonous to Barber. Then, of course, there's a chasm, because Barber keeps reminding us, there is no direct path to union with him. There's always, when you get up on the highest level, before you can get to the union becoming of Barber, in Barber, with Barber, there's always this chasm that can only be bridged when Barber's whim dictates it, when he decides at the right moment. So when it yawns before me, and Francis has obviously felt, he'll shout with joy at this unbridgeable gap. And this gap is so vast, all the journeying seems to be nothing. Just a little walkabout, to use an Aussie term. I will bow, considering another 1,000,000,000 years but a moment for the whim of his kiss. You don't think of Barber, you're not going to get cherished, rewarded by Barber in any way deserving or wanting. It's his whim. If it happens, it happens. And I will drain the chasm's wine cup. Imagine being able to, what an outrageous symbol this is, to say the chasm, and Francis wrote a whole lot of these chasm poems, trying to fill the chasm with tears, not being able to cross the chasm. Francis wrote so many of these, but he's not He's calling it here the chasm's wine cup. The very fact of despair and helplessness is the wine cup of inspiration itself. This is Baba's gift to him, is his helplessness. I'll drain the chasm's wine cup to its last drop of separation and beg my last begging for it to be filled again for an oblation. Rounds it off beautifully, as so often, Francis. Each couplet has its own unity, and then the poem itself ends almost always on such a strong, completing note. And it almost, it's subversive stuff of our expectations. It's giving an intelligible form to the dilemma that we all are facing when we're honest with ourselves. It's not respectable, pious, devotional verse in any way, but it's an invitation to submitting to the divine. And there's a poem which we haven't got time to read out all of it, but just the two stanzas of its conclusion in the next one. Poem 83, which is well worth reading. So, where Francis really wears his heart on his sleeve here in these last two stanzas. To this one he talks of things strange, but sweet to the heart, of how the mighty song of the whole sings in each part. But, in fact, part and whole belong to seeming. Only absolute isness is. And at the lover's delight in this talk, the beloved showers him with bliss kisses. Francis has really stepped things up at the end of this poem. I didn't read them all that well, but there's 6, instead of the usual 4 stresses to a line, it's been stepped up to 6 stresses as a sort of extra emphasis in the conclusion of his poem. And it's a performance from Francis. It's a little drama that happens in his poetry. And the poems are there as a dialogue for you when you're reading them, a dialogue between you and God. This is what poetry is all about. And in a civilization that has aestheticized poetry, which has seen it in matters of as championing human sensitivity, of human self-sufficiency, that we've completely lost sight that real poetry is sacred poetry. And Francis, of course, what a boon for us, because we know, or at least we intuit to some extent, that things are different now after Baba's incarnation. That this intimate dialogue is possible, and which poetry brings to life. And this active reading, you can see how it's quite, it does demand an active response. You have to struggle a bit with a Francis poem. It's another, if I can just pause for another commercial, we put online all Francis's poetry. It's francisbrabazon.org. Some of you will have got onto it. If you just Google in Francis Brabazon. It's just about the first site that comes up. And it's all Francis's poetry, and plus it's commentary on every one of these poems. Now it's commentary that I hope is not tearing the wings off the butterfly. You know, a lot of people are just prepared out of hand to condemn a paraphrase or an explanation of a poem. It's destroying your own private response to it. However, I feel most of us do need a little help sometimes. Not for every poem, but just occasionally think, what the hell was that saying? And be able to look it up. So on this site, you have comments from me on all of these poems of Francis. So if you're baffled or disgusted or whatever with a Francis poem, you can at least get a sympathetic reading of it on this site. It's I hope a big help, and it's been put on by Liz and Stephen, and it's potentially a blessing there for people who don't often read poetry and need a bit of a crutch when they're reading it. Another commercial. Our poetry holdings are quite good in the library. I'm the slave of the master who has not released me from ignorance. Like a planet round the shining sun, I'm content to swing in his dance. The moment of my self-knowledge was fixed by him at the time of the creation, when the suns were born from his singing word, and I in their midst shouting with elation. Except for brief moods of homesickness, ever since then I've been dancing to the calls of this singing caller and to the tune of his love glancing. All our association has been a dialogue which he was sustaining to keep me going on the long journey, make me forget my complaining. Now the talk has been swallowed up in his silence. The dance has ended. I've danced my way back to stone state, completing the journey splendid. Now there remains only the breaking of this stone head with his hammer, to release my self-song and put an end forever to this stammer. How lovingly my beloved has kept me in ignorance on this journey, heartening me at every stage by the thought that with the next step I'd be free. Now, if you could just go back to the previous slide, you probably recognise the parody that's going on there with the Hafiz quote. Tian?
Or the Hafiz quote is, I am the slave of the master who has released me from ignorance. Whatever my master does is of the highest benefit to all concerned.
Yes, that marvellous Hafiz quote that Baba right at the end of his life had read out. A vital document. Yes. Well, so nice shock value, isn't it? Who's not released me from ignorance, and then, but it's all happening like the square dancing that Francis was into the oh Johnny oh stuff, do-si-do your partner and all that stuff. But he makes a poetic use of it here. The caller has them all circling around him and is controlling the whole thing there from the centre. So he makes it a figure for Baba calling the tune, and we're all revolving, of course, and the call of the caller is a love glancing, because it's all sustained by him. Without him, we're nothing. There is nothing apart from him. And so He's
Can I make a little comment?
Yeah.
I just noticed when Francis said, I have danced my way back to stone state, probably what in the 20s, Baba compares to when we go back in evolution, we reach the stone's mind. That's very high, very close.
Yes, Baba said a number of times that somehow you had to emulate the state of a stone in your indifference to desires or in your embracing of hopelessness and helplessness. You had to realise you had as much real say in things as does the stone. But then, of course, it's a typical ploy of Francis's that he's got back to the stone state, he feels completely zonked in the stone state, but the stone has to be ground down to dust so it can be blown away by the inspiration of the breath of the divine. It's a beautiful image that occurs in many of Francis's poems. Well, the alarm's gone off and it's 4:30, and there are so many more poems that can give delight, and I hope in future anniversaries we can do it again, but perhaps in a more participatory workshop way than we've been able to do today. Jai Baba.